Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
It's my pleasure to introduce Sunil Park, who's here today from Korea via Bellevue. And he's in computer science at KAIST in South Korea. Received his BS in computer science from Songsil University in Korea and the MS in computer science at KAIST, and just finished his PhD. And he's done a lot of work on media and news, and today he's going to talk to us about detecting media bias.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me here. I'm Sunil from KAIST, Korea. I'm very glad to talk about my PhD work, which was about understanding the different views of news media and exposing readers to the diversity of viewpoints. And what I'm going to talk about today is the overall context and the big picture of this work for the first 5 minutes, and then I'm going to focus on 2 papers, which I believe to be relevant to this group. Although a lot of material in this work is about dealing with traditional news media, I believe the results and ideas provides many implications and has possibility of extension to social media. So I hope you all enjoyed the talk. If you have any questions, feel free to interrupt. Okay. This project was started by taking a critical view to news media, focusing on that even the same reality can be delivered differently depending on news producers, and that has a great impact in readers' cognition. Let's think about an example together. Well, this is a pretty old example, but I have to use it. It's a really symbolic one. There are 2 pictures about a summit, and when you first see these 2 pictures, you probably think these pictures just capture different moments. 2 different moments out of hundreds of other pictures taken that day. But when I saw these 2 pictures in the front page of these news media, it was really funny to me. To give you some context, this previous president of Korea was considered as a very liberal person, and an important issue that divides liberals and conservative in Korea is the attitude towards U.S. Whether you're trying to be more independent or you're trying to be maintaining a more friendly relationship. And the newspapers on the left are very conservative news media that consistently try to emphasize that there is a problem in the relationship between the United States and this president is causing many conflicts. And it's an amazing coincidence that they all use this same picture. They picked this picture out of thousands of others, the picture which shows a fist and a stern face of President Bush. Now, do these 2 pictures seem to communicate the same feeling? So they're not just about different moments, they're about different impressions. And they probably selected this in purpose in order to shape readers' cognitions in a certain way. So our project had an aim to design a news consumption space where people can discover these different views of news media and have a more comprehensive understanding of the reality, under the belief that having access to diversity and considering them would lead to a more positive result to the community. And why I think this area can generate many research issues is because this news industry has their own well-developed process that evolved for a long time. They have their own system, own culture, so there's a lot to look at it. Also, regarding this issue of bias, research in mass communication says this is a structural, persistent problem of the media industry rather than problem of specific journalists. I'll explain by quoting one experienced journalist who said, news production process itself is a continuous subjective valuation process. And as he said, during news gathering, they choose what events and topics to cover. During news writing, they choose the style of coverage. During news editing, they choose the style of presentation, which article should go to the top, which photo to select. And for each decision, making a fair choice is never easy because they're always influenced by various factors, their own political ideological views, external forces, owners, advertisers. So a news article can be simply seen as a document written in front of a desk, but if we look at this entire process, we can see what kind of various activities happens before actual writing. And this generates many research issues. For example, a lot of work on news article analysis, opinion mining, sentiment analysis, they narrow their view down to the writing style, expression of opinion or sentiment in text. But what this process tells us is that viewpoint can be expressed also before writing in the selection of topic or agenda. For example, we commonly see different media pushing different agendas. And it can be expressed also after writing in the way they create the presentation. The layout of contents, this stage has many other factors in writing, like allocation of space, combination of stories in the layout. So taking account this structural view of the news production process can much widen the scope of related research. And our basic idea was to look at this problem from a reader's perspective. We thought it's possible to support readers to overcome specific media's view, and this would mitigate the effects of bias to some extent. And an effective way to do this is to, we thought an effective way is to help readers to always recognize the existence of different views and compare them. So we try to develop automatic news browsing tools that expose readers to diversity and change their daily news browsing behavior. And I think this is a really practical approach. There could be other approaches if we take a wider view to multiple disciplines. For example, we can think about the efforts of journalists at the news production stage. They try to observe journalism ethics and standards. They try alternative reporting formats, point-counterpoint, roundtable discussions. But these efforts require significant change in the news production process, and the success depends on individual journalists. And after production, there are some researchers, experts who try to manually monitor and diagnose bias in contents. There are some limited trials trying to measure or correct bias. But the point I want to make is increasing diversity would be a practical way compared to these approaches, because other approaches like measurement correction inherently involves difficult or vague questions like defining what bias is or defining what an unbiased news is. It's a very difficult question which is hard to come up with a clear definition because of its subjective nature. But it's still possible to say there is a difference between viewpoints and just reveal that viewpoints without judging a specific view as biased. And by doing so, we can avoid these difficult questions. And I think this also fits well with our goal. Our goal is not to assume an unbiased state and pursue that, but is to encourage readers to have access to diversity and considering them. Does that make sense? And before I finish the discussion about this big picture, I want to provide an overview of this research space and to talk about the parts that my work covered. I think there can be about 4 main dimensions that characterize this research space. First, the domain of article you deal with, because the characteristic of discourse is going to be different. And second, the framing method. There are many ways how viewpoints are expressed in news articles. Third, the development of the technique for news article analysis. And fourth, design and evaluation of the user interface. And my work first started by studying the most common type of article that we face in ordinary news browsing session, which is straight news, and then studied a closely related framing method, which is fact selection, and then try to develop technique that can capture diversity for a straight news article considering the different fact selections, and then studied the impact in user experience. And we later extended this work to deal with news articles of specific domain that many people have interest. And I think a lot of future work can be made by following each of this dimension. For example, this research could be extended by covering another domain of article like interview or editorial, or it could be extended by studying a different type of framing method like photo selection, space allocation. So I wish this work could be considered as an initial work that tried to open a big research space. Now, I'm going to narrow down to the actual work, which consists of 3 parts. The first part is about the system we developed for a straight news article, which serves as a basic framework implementing our approach. And later parts are component technology we made for more advanced news article analysis. And in this talk, I'm going to mainly talk about the first 2 parts. The system we developed, I'm just going to use an example to help you make sense of this system. Imagine that your government announced a new property tax plan. And let's assume the news articles you get to see about this tax plan are like this. This is an actual list of news articles captured from Google News Korea. And you can see a lot of articles talking about the tax increase. When readers are only exposed to these articles, they may instantly feel that the tax is going to be increased for their houses. But this is NewsCube. The articles that talk about the tax increase are clustered into a certain area, and the system provides an overview, classified view of articles that provides different information about this plan. You can find an article that covers the argument of the policy designer who says this is a normalization of property tax and how this collected tax is going to be used to suburban areas. And also there was an article that says the plan doesn't affect houses in most districts at all. And these different articles provide different viewpoints and information about this tax plan. And we also later observed that being aware of these different stories lead to different perception about this plan. So the system was designed to encourage readers to browse through these different stories. Well, in many news services, news articles are typically organized based on events. So when a user visits, they select and read one article per topic, and they move on to another topic. Well, it would be very rare, but even if the user wants to read different stories related to the same event as Michael, they would have to expand this event and then click this small link, and then they would find a lot of articles in a simple list interface. So they have to go through and try to find different stories. We try to change this interaction sequence, so whenever the user clicks an event, the system provides an overview of different stories. And even when the user moves on to a specific article, the interface tries to give awareness on the different articles that the user didn't access. We conceptualize this way of news browsing as aspect-level news browsing, which means it helps readers to browse through different aspects of the selected event that are not covered in a single story. So the goal of the system was to lay a basic framework that can be used to test if diversity can be achieved through automatic news browsing interfaces. Although this is a single design goal, there were a wide variety of issues we had to deal with in development. The breadth of issues you get to deal with when you build an automatic system. So in the first part of this work, we focused on characterizing these issues and find a feasible solution for each issue, rather than going deep and try to find an optimal solution for a specific problem. And among those, I'm going to mainly talk about three issues that we dealt with in this study. First one is how this concept diversity should be interpreted for straight news articles. And the second is how the classification methods should capture this diversity. And the third one is whether this presentation of diversity have impact on user experience. Okay. Now, a fundamental issue is how this diversity should be interpreted for straight news, which means what should be the criteria when we judge the difference between articles. This is a very important but difficult question because there can be many properties related to viewpoints. For example, nuance of specific words, tone, style of writing. So we try to find a solution that provides a basis considering the characteristic of our data. Straight news is a typical form of news that mainly intend to deliver facts to inform readers and doesn't include much journalist commentary or opinion. So we try to interpret this diversity from an information selection view, which means different viewpoint would lead to different selection of information. As in these example articles, although they cover the same event, the central theme articulated in the story that we call aspect is different among articles. And this also fits well with a widely quoted definition on news framing of the mass communication literature, which says different selection of aspects is an important way of expressing viewpoints. Well, we could consider other factors like tone or style of writing, but these factors are inherently subjective to some extent and has subtlety, so it's hard to interpret clearly. So we first focused on this different selection of aspects. And why I believe this interpretation provides a basis is not just because it's related to a mass communication theory, but we also try to We also verified the effectiveness of this interpretation experimentally. We try to see if people have agreement when they interpret diversity in this way, which means if we give this criteria, do people interpret it in the same manner? We did 2 experiments. The first one was we asked people to interpret the articulated aspect for a sample of article. We asked them to select the core sentences that seem to describe the articulated aspect. So if they interpreted similarly, they would select the same set of sentences. And the second experiment was to see the agreement in the classification, when they judged the similarity between articles. So we gave them a set of news articles covering the same event, and then asked them to perform aspect level classification, and then observe the similarity between classification results. And in both experiments, there was a high level of agreement, which means interpreting diversity in this way is an effective approach. So the goal of the classification method should be to create a classification result that is similar to a manually created classification result that is agreed among different people. And the second issue is now about this how we should make this classification method. Well, this itself is a big research problem. There's a lot of work on document indexing, feature extraction, document classification. But we try to build a unique solution specific to our data because we deal with this specific type of documents, straight news articles. Which we try to build it based on close observation of news reporters, news outlets, and discover some useful heuristics that can be combined with conventional NLP techniques. I'm just going to briefly summarize the key ideas here. We observed how journalists write stories to understand how they put the key information in news articles. And we found this rule called the inverted pyramid style of writing, which says they put the key information first and they support it in the diminishing order of importance in the main text. So this tells us where the important terms are likely to be located and how much they're important based on how much they're supported in the main text. And for classification, we use this framing cycle. When multiple news outlets cover the same event, there's a certain pattern. As in this example shows the news articles that cover the same event, the amount of article published over time, and the color represents the covered aspect in this article. As you can see, at the start of the event, most of the news articles cover the same stories, and the covered aspect diverge over time. And this is closely related to the news gathering behavior of reporters. At the start of an event, they tend to rely on identical news sources like press releases, news agency reports, and later, depending on their editing direction, they reach out for different sources, different stakeholders, experts, and as they do, to covered aspect diverge. When we see this framing cycle from a classification view, we can see a long tail-like distribution of classification result. There's a big article group, which include the majority of articles, which cover the early stage aspect. And then there are several small groups as a result of this divergence. Well, I'm not going to explain the detail of this algorithm, but knowing this kind of distribution of the classification result in advance can support the classification task significantly. I think an analogy can be made to latent semantic indexing. LSI tries to use the latent meaning behind the term, right? What I tried to do was to use this latent distribution of classification result in the classification task. Well, if you have a question, I can explain about the detail later.
Can I?
Yeah.
Quick question. I find this pattern extremely interesting, and I was wondering if is this a very, very general pattern that you observe across like different types of news events, right? Let's say disasters or unexpected events versus expected events like elections with a certain outcome, or do you see differences?
This is I observed regardless of the news category, and it was quite general, but the difference I observed was with news events that evolve really quickly, this pattern is quite different for those. For example, if the event transforms into a different event and evolves differently, then this like shrinks and there's another big spike later. So that was the difference I observed among use events. And we also observed that applying these kind of ideas can improve the performance. We measure the accuracy by comparing the classification result to the manually created classification result, which was obtained in the previous experiment. Remember the experiment? We asked them people to manually classify result, and we measured the similarity using the F measure, and we observed that applying this ideas could, improve the accuracy, the similarity of the classification result to the manually created classification results. And the last issue is the user experience study. And these are very crucial experiments because it verifies the idea whether news browsing interface can shape behavior and cognition. The experiment was twofold. We tried to see if the system encouraged readers to select and read more diverse stories, and later try to observe whether that has an impact in readers' cognition. And considering this behavioral aspect, we traced what articles people read when they use the system. We conducted a between-subject study. So one group used NewsCube, one group used Google News, one group used RandomCube. RandomCube, which has the same interface as NewsCube, but the articles were classified randomly. So by comparing NewsCube with Google News, you can see if the difference of interface leads to different behavior. And by comparing NewsCube to RandomCube, we can see if a proper classification is necessary. And we measured the number of articles read by each user and also the diversity of read articles. And to briefly summarize the result, the NewsCube users did read more number of articles and also more diverse stories, which indicates that if the interface more prominently displays the articles that give different information about this selected event, that definitely seems to increase the chance for a user to select it. And I think it's possible to speculate more about additional factors which may influence readers' article selection by comparing with another closely related work. There's a group in University of Michigan who did a very similar study. Sean Munson and Professor Paul Resnick did a study on the relationship between readers' satisfaction and the amount of liberal or conservative items in the recommendation list. And they tested some visualization technique like highlighting items or changing orders. And they somewhat reported a contradictory result, which says readers' satisfaction didn't significantly change depending on the visualization technique. And I thought this may reveal the different motive of users, which would be another important factor. In their work, they used politically explicit content like blog posts, political commentary, and the participant also had a clear political preference. So what the interface is asking is close to, I know that you have a certain viewpoint, and here are items that express opposing viewpoints. What would you select? But in our case, we used straight news articles, which doesn't explicitly express political preference. And many of the participants didn't have a clear political preference. And also we organized them based on topic. So what the interface is asking is close to, here are articles that give different information about this selected event that you don't know. Although this may seem to be a subtle thing, but I think it can be an important one that can lead to different interface strategy. For example, people may not be generous to the content that expressed opposing view, but they may want to read the article that gives different information they don't know about the selected event. There could be motive to seek opposing views, and there could be motive to seek more context and information. And if many people show this kind of behavior, being generous to articles that give different information they don't know, the interface can try to increase diversity further by using primarily fact-based articles or organizing based on content, so helping users to find more relevant but new information. And as such, I think it's going to be possible to discover additional factors and try to find more elaborated interface strategy. And coming back to our work, considering the cognitive aspect, we try to more closely observe the opinion development process. We recruited both people who have a clear political preference and also those who didn't have a clear political preference. And for each group, half of them used NewsCube, and half of them used Google News, and we observed the difference between them. And we did observe some promising points. I'm going to summarize them here. Regardless of the existence of predetermined views, NewsCube users did show some difference from Google News users. NewsCube users, when they use the system, they instantly recognize that the news events they're reading are contentious issues, so it can be seen from different perspectives. But compared to that, the Google News user who didn't have a predetermined opinion, they tend to just follow the viewpoint based on the article they read. This was the first difference. And another difference we observed was while we did the interview, when NewsCube users explained their viewpoints, they brought up much more detailed information compared to Google News users because they read more articles and get better aware of that event. And another point was when they explained their viewpoint, they brought up different views and commented about them and why they didn't follow those viewpoints. Well, I'm not saying that they accepted or agreed with different viewpoints, but at least they knew it and they brought up, commented about that. So we could see that they're considering it. And I would like to conclude this first part by mentioning some interesting future research questions. Considering the behavioral aspect, I think it's going to be interesting to see if people consistently seek diversity or they just return to their original behavior in long term. And as I mentioned, it's going to be interesting to discover more interface factors and strategy. And considering the cognitive aspect, one interesting thing we observed was some people were more confident about their viewpoint after being aware of different views because they considered it and they had reason why they picked this viewpoint. But on the other hand, there were also people who hesitated to pick a specific position after being aware of different views. So I think it's going to be also interesting to see if there's a relation between greater exposure and paralysis and apathy. And before I move on to the second part, if there's any questions, I can answer you. If there's no question, I can just move on. Okay. Now, after building the system, we try to more focus on specific domain of article that many people have interest. And absolutely, political news articles was one of that important area. And one motivation came from the responses from our user studies. Many people expected a clear opposing category of news articles like liberal or conservative. But actually, when you look at news articles, it's difficult to put them into this clear opposing frame in many cases. But anyhow, people expect that pretty much because similar to US, liberal versus conservative is a very typical frame that people use to view politics. And although this frame has many limitations, it's also used in many studies. Political discourse, political science studies use this frame to characterize the discourse. There are a lot of studies on internet contents based on this frame. Also, there are many studies on characterizing people's political preference. But the problem is that it's really difficult to interpret political orientation from news articles. Political discourse is very complex. It's involved in a wide variety of issues. Politician, parties, government, social policy, foreign policy, even religion. And the discourse is realized differently depending on each of this issue. So let's see some example arguments about this healthcare reform debate reported in news articles. And as you can see here, the text doesn't simply says for healthcare or against healthcare. They address various different topics around the reform, emphasize different facts, articulate different arguments. Well, people who have the knowledge about this issue can interpret whether the arguments are supportive or negative to the reform, but it's difficult to do that computationally. And what makes more difficult, particular for a news article, is that the discourse changes rapidly. A new quote, new fact always appears and people respond to that update. So the discourse rapidly continuously changes in a daily basis or sometimes faster. Now we can think of several directions of solution for this problem. The first one would be, of course, approaching based on text analysis. Actually, there are a number of works that employ this approach. They often pick some specific issues and conduct case study on those issues. But I thought this approach has somewhat limited to apply in real-world scenarios because, well, here's how they do it. They pick an issue, they use some data as training data, and develop classifier and test it in other documents addressing the same topic. But because this classifier is specifically trained to this specific issue, whenever a new issue appears, you have to do this all over again. This is a very costly process, especially when discourse changes rapidly as in news articles. And another thing we can think of is using the metadata on news articles. I got this question pretty frequently, which says, can we identify the new political orientation from the source information? And this is partly true. It's easier to find liberal stories from the New York Times and find conservative stories from Wall Street Journal. And we conducted a quick analysis measuring the proportion of news articles published from the sources which have a clear political preference. Anyone who want to guess? Oh, no idea? It was about 25%. So for like 74%, it's difficult to directly infer the political orientation from the news source information. Well, this was done with news articles in Korea. Right? So it might be different but anyhow. And also regarding this 26%, the articles published from the sources which have a clear political preference, they don't always produce like politically biased content. So we have to think about some more ideas. And we thought there will be something valuable in social annotation on news articles and took an approach using them because it includes collective knowledge of people who are able to interpret language, issues, also with political context, which is required for political view analysis. We specifically used the comments on news articles. Actually, the commenters, we thought there will be people who actively react to political orientation of news articles and provide valuable feedbacks. Because people tend to have a strong and clear political preference, and that can be characterized either as liberal or conservative. And these political preference is likely to be consistent over time and consistent over issue. I'm going to show some example comments responding to an example news event, which was about nomination of a prime minister in Korea made by the Korean president. And, well, the first comment says, I'm going to translate it. So, the president is very smart. The nominee was considered as a potential presidential candidate, also from the opposition parties. So the nomination looks bipartisan. The second comment says that it comments about the nominee's thought about a government project. The nominee looks like so naive, or if he's not, then he's being stupid. And the third comment responds to a story about a suspicion related to the nominee saying, well, was basically about, it's just swearing the nominee. Well, anyhow, we can see that these commenters all understand the meaning and the nomination and express their thoughts in the comments.
What was the medium? Is this a blog or is it a site? Is it the news site where people can leave comments?
Yeah.
Okay.
So, excuse me. Okay, anyhow. So this gives a glimpse of our idea. Assume there's a person who actively leaves comment to many news articles, and let's assume she's liberal. And there's a certain pattern in her behavior. When she reads a liberal article, she tends to leave a positive comment. And when she reads a conservative article, let's say she leaves a very negative comment. We call this pattern as sentiment pattern, the pattern in the sentiment of comments responding to political orientation of news articles. If this sort of pattern is quite common, this problem can be much easier. Just by identifying the sentiment of comments, we can predict the political orientation of news articles. And identifying the sentiment of comments is likely to be easier than analyzing political orientation because comments tend to be concise. People explicitly express sentiment, and they often include explicit words like great, worse, bad. So our study was to analyze the usefulness of this sentiment pattern from various perspectives, whether we can really observe such pattern, and how common that pattern is, and how regular the pattern is. And I think the contribution of this work is majorly in the detailed empirical investigation of commenters and helping follow-up works to think about how they can use this. And I think understanding and characterizing this kind of behavioral pattern will be also useful in social media, tweets. This kind of ideas can be applied to social media. And the data set we used for this study, we collected all data from Naver News, which is a very popular news portal in South Korea. We first sampled 2 sets of news articles. The general set is made by crawling the political issue archive, which records major political issues. And the popular set is made, the general set includes articles with many comments and also those with few comments. And the popular set is made by crawling the 20 most popular political news of the day for a 6-month period. And as the stories are popular, they all have many comments. And from each set, we extracted top 50 commenters who leave the most comment. And from each commenter, we sampled 40 comments to trace their comment history. And we observed this data regarding these 3 questions. These are the major points we need to understand to see how effective this approach can be. First, whether there are active commenters, those who leave comments on a large amount of articles. If there are active commenters, it's possible to deal with a large number of news articles with a small number of commenters. Second, whether they show a clear and consistent political preference, either as liberal or conservative. And third, and the most important, is whether they really show this kind of regular sentiment pattern. I'm going to summarize our observation regarding these points. We measured the amount of covered articles by these top 50 commenters. And as you can see here, these top 50 commenters cover most of the popular news articles. But the coverage seems to be low for general news articles, but this is mainly because there are many articles that have few comments. If this red dotted line here shows the proportion of news articles that have at least 5 comments. So if we only consider these articles, the coverage is not low, it's actually significant. And covering the articles with many comments is important because news articles that are located in visible places like center or head of a web page, they get many comments. And the news articles that only have few comments, they were the articles that were located in unnoticeable places. So these results indicate that these top 50 commenters are likely to cover most of the articles that people are likely to read. And we also observed that these top 50 commenters are active for a long time. Among the commenters of the popular set, near 74% left comments more than 6 months. And during this period, they also left comments frequently. We measured the time between 2 consecutive commenter, and that was less than 3 days in most cases. So with 92% chance, they come back within 3 days and leave another comment. The result was pretty much similar for the general set, so I'm just going to skip this. And then we studied whether these commenters show a clear political preference. We observed the preference based on the position they expressed about the issues they discussed in their comments. For example, if the position was consistently conservative, we classified the commenter as conservative. And if the position switched at least once in our sample. We classify the commenter as a vague commenter. And we observe that most of them do show consistency. For the general set, 54 liberal, 38 conservative. Popular set, 62 conservative. Okay, 24 liberal. And
Liberal's got to get going.
That's a very interesting symmetry there.
Okay. Wait, this might be because maybe there are people who, well, I'm not sure, but this is just a rumor, but anyhow, there's a story that the government hires some commenters to leave comment that support their agendas.
I think that's true.
The conservatives don't think to look outside the thing right in front of them.
Pardon me?
I said, or the conservatives only look at the thing that's right in front of them. They don't think long enough to go beyond that.
But there are some hired commenters.
Oh, really?
Yes.
I think that's probably not the case here. I mean, you have hired sort of reviewers, who leave review spam on review sites in a commercial, environment.
Right.
But I think politically, it's at least I'm not aware that it's a big
Seemed like it, but I haven't actually thought about it.
This data was observed under this conservative administration. And maybe we have a lot of conservative for the popular set because maybe they target popular news articles to have access to a lot of people. And last and the most important was whether these commenters show a regular sentiment pattern. It's important to note that consistency of political orientation doesn't guarantee a regular pattern. For example, even if a person is liberal, the person may leave negative comment to any article, regardless of the political orientation of these articles. The person may always attack conservatives, regardless of the content of news articles. That's not the pattern we expect. What we expect is to express different sentiments depending on political orientation of news article. And we characterize the sentiment pattern with two types of commenting behavior, positive match and the negative match. For example, if this woman is liberal, the positive match is to leave a positive comment to a liberal article, and the negative match is to leave a negative comment to a conservative article. If this woman was conservative, they would indicate the opposite. We observed how frequently these positive matches or negative matches appear in the comment history. If they appear most of the times, that means the person shows a very regular sentiment pattern. And for each person, we measured the degree of regularity using conditional probability, and we observed that some commenters do show a pretty regular sentiment pattern. It's not that general, but there are some portion of people who show this kind of regular sentiment pattern. And I'm going to talk about how we use this people who show regular behavior. We model each individual commenter as a base classifier, which takes the sentiment of a comment as input and outputs the maximum likely class of the political article. It's really simple, very, very simple model. And we conducted experiments to see the accuracy of this idea. We compared three methods, two versions of our idea, and a typical text-based classification method. The difference between the two versions is in how we analyze the sentiment of comment. For the first version, we did it manually, so this shows the upper bound of the proposed idea. And text classification was a very typical one, TF-IDF combined with an SVM classifier. And we first used 14 commenters who show a really regular sentiment pattern. And in the result, the method achieved around 75% in both general and popular set. And both versions outperformed the text analysis method. And we also measured the coverage of the proposed idea. Recall that we only used a small number of commenters who show really regular behavior. The coverage was about 31 for the popular set, but it was really low for the general set, which is mainly because there are many articles with few comments. If we only consider the articles which have more than 5 comments, the coverage increases to 21%. And in the second round, we included more commenters who show a little bit less regular behavior. So we added 25 people and measured the performance. And the accuracy drops a little bit as we include this less regular commenters, but it still achieves around 70%, and both versions still outperforms text-based analysis method. And the coverage increases significantly. It's covered almost the half of the news articles. And another important experiment was about the learning curve. We analyzed the accuracy while varying the size of the training data from 5 samples per commenter to 20 samples per commenter. And we observed that the accuracy was quite stable regardless of this size of the training data. This means that we don't need that many samples for training. This would much relieve the burden in real usage scenarios. And we also tested one simple extension of this idea, which is to use multiple commenters who comment on the same article. It basically aggregates the prediction of individual commenter. This could be more robust to irregular behavior of one commenter because it can be complemented by other commenters. And this is the result, which is pretty straightforward. If we use more number of commenters, accuracies tend to increase, but the coverage decreases because more number of commenters have to leave comment. So I'm going to conclude this talk by discussing some of the potential future work. I think this kind of study provides meaningful implication to other types of media like Twitter or other social media. First of all, I believe similar pattern can be also observed from social media. But of course, the way how users reveal their preference will be different because in social media, their identity is quite revealed. So the style of language may be different. People may have different motives. They may try to recommend some content. And they may show some different patterns. And also, I think also this kind of behavioral pattern will be observed in other cases when people react to products, companies, brands. So it would be possible to extend this idea to these different domains. And also, I think more sophisticated modeling of this behavior would be also possible. So we maybe also think about how we could use other social annotation data like Facebook like button, blog links, etc. And I think I talked about an hour. So this is the part I prepared. So if there's any question, I would be happy to take questions.
Yeah, that was great. I have a question. So it's kind of going back to the earlier part of your talk. So well, I'll talk about another paper, and then hopefully this will come back around to your. So there's some work from Ryan White and Eric Horvitz here on cyberchondria. Cyberchondria, I don't know if you've seen this paper, but it's the tendency that when you're searching about medical conditions online to very quickly think you have cancer or some totally horrible thing. You start off searching for headache, and before you know it, you're reading about brain cancer, and you're all paranoid or whatever. So anyway, it's a fun paper. But I think the general point of that paper that might apply, especially to the first part of your work, was that the probabilities that are conveyed to you in the search results are actually totally out of whack with reality, right? So when you search for headache, Google shows you lots of links about brain cancer when actually, so it looks like, based on the links, it's like a 50% chance of brain cancer, when in reality it's like 1 in 10, 100,000 or something. Okay. So how that relates to the first part is, you were pulling out these sort of different attributes and viewpoints into different sections. So there may be a role for conveying, what was the one about taxes? There's so opinion is one thing, right? The different sides. But the thing about taxes, there may be a role for conveying to the user somehow something that conveys the probability of outcome or sort of the underlying reality of the situation. Does that make sense? So you showed the example was there's a whole bunch of stuff about taxes. And it's like people might think, oh my God, there's going to be some big tax hike. Well, is there any way to find out what is the likelihood of taxes
okay.
coming out. So it's one thing to say, you know, here's the pro taxes and here's the negative,
Okay.
but if pro is actually very likely to happen, then maybe, I don't know, you bump that up or something. I don't know if there's a way to sort of incorporate some notion of these kind of underlying, the sort of probability of these things actually happening.
I mean, you could, if you have like really a multitude of articles, right? I mean, you showed, I think, 4 on the NewsCube, right, around the tax, the property tax situation. But let's say you show 4, but you have 20 in the background, right? I mean, you could sort of make it visually clear which one is sort of more similar. In terms of the aspect to most of the ones in the back.
Yeah, exactly. Like, right. So when you pull out, the counter example or something, if only 2 out of 100 articles are actually about the counter, maybe, I don't know, convey that or somehow use that to give users almost like a little bit of a meta perspective on the issue.
We could think about, example, the proportion of news articles that cover a certain aspect, and also the proportion of articles that cover different aspect. We can display that kind of information to help readers to make sense about the distribution. But, well, NewsCube system is actually trying to increase the likelihood of the display of like minor things that are not reported in majority of news articles, pushing people to, get more variety of information.
Yeah, no, totally. For opinion pieces and viewpoints, and absolutely. In fact, I was thinking about when you were talking about NewsCube, I was thinking about this cyberchondria stuff. And I was thinking using that interface in these health contexts could be, might be kind of useful, because I think that the standard interface that doesn't make any distinction between the thing that's highly unlikely and the thing in reality and the thing that's very likely, is actually doing the end user a real disservice.
I wanted to show you this chart, which is about why I stick on this idea of increasing diversity. This shows market share in newspaper market share in South Korea. There's 3 lines shows the market share of the 3 very conservative news media, which I showed at the first slide. And the top line here shows the sum of these 3 media, showing how much the market is concentrated to these 3 media. While they hold about like 60% of the market share consistently for decades, these poor 2 lines shows the newspaper market share that are considered as liberal. So you can see an amazing, clear imbalance. This is like having like 3 Fox News channel in small country.
Right. So what's the remainder is neutral or balanced or something?
Remainders?
Set 30% or so.
Yeah, those are not like clear. Which doesn't have a clear. But mostly like many of the newspapers are conservative side in South Korea.
What is the, let's say, the electoral split in the population between liberal and conservative? Does it sort of, half-half, and does it flip in elections?
Flips in election, but pretty much close to like half and half.
Yeah. So this is really sort of not representing the population.
Right.
So there's similar trend with the TV channels. So we have like 3 major TV channels, and if anything, any like popular new health method, take vitamin C every day, something like that. Some news and all these channels show, and that everyone can do. I mean, everyone in Korea basically knows it. So it's not quite true here. So that's the biggest difference.
Oh, interesting.
So, yeah, TV channels, and there are very major TV channels that everyone sees. And I have one quick question. So you mentioned about the reverse pyramid structure of a newspaper, and that makes it easier to extract some of the aspects. Then would it apply to other, I don't know, like paper, our research paper, because there are like, certainly viewpoints, for operating system. Let's not use the, they're like very controversial viewpoints, and they, we hate each other or something like that, or they're very So does it only apply to the newspaper, or it can be generalized to other materials like research papers or some journals or?
I think there would be another kind of structure for other type of documents, pretty much, and I think there actually are works that use specific structure for research papers. A lot of people use the terms in the abstract section more important.
So as long as you find about proper structure pertaining that content, then it's okay. Then you can apply it to general.
Yeah, I guess. And this inverted pyramid structure is like it's been like an implicit standard for a long time when journalists write stories, because it's related to, like, when you write a story and then you don't have enough time to edit it, but you have to put it. But when you get another advertisement, you have to cut the article from the bottom. You can simply cut it. That's why, like, it's kind of.
But I think it's also cognitively probably easier, just sort of
make
the main point first.
Right.
And I mean, obviously we all read from from
Yeah,
the
right.
beginning to the end. So,
exactly.
so you want to get the most important information out, because you don't even know if people are going to read beyond things. And I mean, that's also why an automatic summarization. It's the simplest baseline is always to take the first two sentences, and it's very hard to read that.
Are people doing that with research papers? I mean, research papers do, like you said, there's a pretty clear structure, right? I mean,
the abstract is.
First of all, there's the abstract, but then you've got, here's an intro, here's the related work, here are my findings, here's the discussion. Yeah, it seems like.
I think there's also many works who try to analyze the relation between papers based on the related work section. Like the sense of how they're the sense when they quote each other.
The NewsCube website, that's public, right?
Yeah.
What was the response? I'd just be curious, how many, did you get some media coverage in Korea, and what was the traffic like?
Well, it was like more than probably maybe 4 years. But at that time, it didn't make it didn't have big impacts. I didn't get any media coverage, and only a small portion of people used it. It was like several hundreds, below thousands. And one reason might be because if I want to make this site to have really a big impact, I had to compete with like internet news portals, which provide a lot of different services. And when the users of NewsCube, they just first visit and says, "Oh, this is pretty new thing, and it's really different," and they go on to the news website they usually go. So it didn't work. I didn't get a lot of traffic.
Yeah, but I think that's a general problem. Right? All kinds of experimental systems.
It's tough.
But I think situation is pretty much better these days, because people are Twitter, for example, to advertise their work, and they get a lot of access to really many people, even if it will be a short time history, but anyhow, you have much more access to many people.
I was supposed to be somewhere 3, but you could use Twitter to tweet out different viewpoints on the same topic, right?
Right.
You could have different Twitter. What's that? Right, yeah, exactly. You just take your same stories and just pump them out in Twitter and just say, viewpoint number 1, viewpoint number 2, or whatever.
Right, definitely.
Just push it at people, basically. Yeah, that always helps get users.
Right.
Put it in front of their eyeballs. Anyway, I have to run it. I have to be somewhere too. That was very cool.
Yeah,
Thank you. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.